It was a typical sunny afternoon in the neighborhood, the kind of day where the sound of lawnmowers hummed in the distance, kids rode bikes up and down the cul-de-sac, and life seemed perfectly peaceful. My family and I had just moved in a few months ago, thrilled by the charm of our new community. The neighbors were friendly enough, the lawns were immaculately trimmed, and everything seemed like a suburban dream, until Karen appeared. Karen wasn't just a neighbor, she was a force of nature. With her perfectly styled bob haircut, clipboard in hand, and an air of authority no one had granted her, Karen patrolled the streets like a self-appointed sheriff. She wasn't about to let a single leaf go unaccounted for or a blade of grass grow out of place. Her presence was impossible to ignore, especially when she marched up to my front door one Saturday morning, her signature scowl firmly in place. "I couldn't help but notice," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "that your mailbox doesn't conform to the HOA's aesthetic guidelines." She pointed to my perfectly ordinary mailbox, which, as far as I knew, looked just like everyone else's. Before I could respond, she added, "We'll need to address this immediately. Property values are at stake." That was my first encounter with Karen, the queen of petty complaints and unwritten rules. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of a whirlwind of drama that would turn our peaceful neighborhood into the stage for one of the most absurd conflicts I'd ever experienced. Karen's reign over the neighborhood was nothing short of legendary, or infamous, depending on who you asked. She seemed to thrive on a sense of authority, her clipboard serving as a badge of power. Within days of our first encounter, I started to notice the absurd lengths she would go to enforce her self-imposed rules. One morning I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. Confused, I read it. "Grass exceeds allowable height by 0.5 inches. Immediate action required." I stared at my freshly mowed lawn in disbelief. Karen, standing across the street with her hands on her hips, offered a triumphant smirk as if she'd caught me red-handed committing a heinous crime. Her power trip didn't stop there. Karen had a habit of targeting the smallest, most ridiculous infractions. One of my neighbors, Tom, received a warning because his trash bins were out an hour earlier than the HOA guidelines allowed. Another, Jenny, was reprimanded for having unauthorized holiday lights strung on her porch well after the season had ended. Karen's dramatics were unmatched. She once stood in front of a neighbor's mailbox for 20 minutes, glaring at it like it had personally offended her. When I asked her what she was doing, she replied, "This mailbox is non-compliant with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. It's an eyesore and I'm documenting it for the HOA." Despite the absurdity of her actions, Karen carried herself with unwavering confidence, as if she were on a righteous mission to single-handedly preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. But for the rest of us, her antics were a constant source of frustration, and, admittedly, a little entertainment. Dealing with Karen required a level of patience I wasn't sure I possessed. At first, I tried reasoning with her, hoping that a calm, rational approach might de-escalate her relentless crusade. When she came by to inform me that my garden gnome was not in keeping with the neighborhood's character, I politely explained that it had been a gift from my grandmother. Her reaction was theatrical, to say the least. She gasped, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "A garden gnome? Do you realize what this does to property values? It's practically a gateway to tacky flamingos and inflatable Santas." I stifled a laugh and assured her the gnome wasn't going anywhere. Her response was to double down, scribbling furiously on her clipboard as if preparing a formal report for the HOA. Things escalated when Karen began threatening fines for minor violations. One day she accused me of painting my front door in an unapproved color. "This shade of blue," she declared, pointing dramatically, "is not on the HOA's sanctioned palette." "It's navy," I replied, holding up the HOA guidelines. "Right here on page 5. Karen squinted at the page, then at my door before muttering something about lighting tricks. "Don't think I won't check again," she warned, marching off with a huff. While I tried to keep my cool, Karen's antics became increasingly difficult to ignore. It seemed no matter how much I followed the rules, she would always find some trivial issue to blow out of proportion. It was becoming clear that reasoning with her wasn't enough. Karen was determined to enforce her version of order, and I would need to find a way to push back. As Karen's antics grew more absurd, the neighborhood began to buzz with gossip and divided opinions. Some residents seemed to egg her on, either out of fear or sheer amusement at the chaos she caused. Others, like me, quietly rolled their eyes and swapped stories about her latest exploits. Tom, my next-door neighbor, was the first to share his own Karen horror story. She accused my cat of trespassing, he whispered one evening as we stood by the fence. Said Whiskers was ruining her flower beds. Can you believe it? The cat doesn't even leave my yard. Jenny, who lived 2 doors down, chimed in during a casual conversation. Last summer she called the cops on my kids' lemonade stand. Said they didn't have the proper permits. My 8-year-old still hasn't forgiven her. Despite Karen's relentless efforts to maintain her version of order, not everyone was on board. A few neighbors quietly supported me, forming an unofficial coalition against her tyranny. We met during late-night chats in driveways or exchanged knowing looks during her latest rounds of enforcement. I heard she's been sneaking around with a tape measure, one neighbor confided. Measuring grass lengths at night. It's like she thinks she's part of some HOA secret police. The more Karen pushed, the more unified the neighborhood became, at least those of us who were fed up. While her antics were frustrating, they also provided a strange sort of camaraderie. The stories we shared were enough to make us laugh through the absurdity, but beneath the humor was a growing tension. It was clear Karen wasn't going to stop until she had total control, and the rest of us weren't about to let that happen. It was time to fight back, one ridiculous complaint at a time. Karen's relentless crusade against the neighborhood reached new levels of absurdity, and it became clear that a turning point was inevitable. I decided it was time to gather evidence of her behavior, not just to protect myself, but to show the HOA and the neighborhood just how out of control she had become. Armed with a smartphone, I began documenting Karen's antics. I filmed her measuring my grass with a ruler, muttering under her breath about neighborhood standards. I saved the violation notices she left taped to my door, each more ridiculous than the last. My collection even included photos of her snooping around a neighbor's backyard, claiming she was inspecting for unauthorized lawn decorations. As Karen became more desperate to maintain control, her actions only grew more bizarre. She filed a complaint with the HOA about a neighbor's garden fountain, claiming it was too noisy. She even attempted to ticket someone's parked car for being too red. The tipping point came when Karen stormed into the monthly HOA meeting with a binder labeled Neighborhood Offenders. It was a dramatic scene. Karen slammed the binder onto the table and began listing her grievances, complete with printed photos of supposed violations. But this time I was ready. When it was my turn to speak, I presented my own evidence. I showed the videos, shared the violation notices, and pointed out how many of Karen's complaints were based on rules that didn't even exist. The room erupted in whispers and suppressed laughter as Karen's absurdity was laid bare. Karen's composure began to crack. She sputtered excuses, claiming she was only trying to protect property values, but the damage was done. Even the HOA board members, who had tolerated her antics for years, couldn't defend her anymore. By the end of the meeting, the board announced that Karen was being removed from her unofficial enforcement role. To top it off, she was fined for her own violations, including an unapproved fence she'd installed without proper permits. It was a satisfying moment, watching Karen's empire crumble under the weight of her own behavior. For the first time, she was on the receiving end of the very rules she'd been so eager to impose on others. With Karen officially dethroned, the neighborhood collectively let out a sigh of relief, and a few cheers. The HOA's decision to remove her from any position of influence was the talk of the block. But the true cherry on top came a few days later, when Karen received her own violation notice. The notice was for her garish, oversized mailbox, which had long been a blight on the otherwise uniform row of mailboxes in the neighborhood. The HOA, armed with a newfound sense of fairness, decided to apply the same standards to Karen that she had so mercilessly applied to everyone else. Watching her storm out to rip the notice off her mailbox was pure poetic justice. Karen's downfall was met with quiet celebration. Neighbors who had once feared her clipboard and scrutinizing gaze began to reclaim their lives. Tom, the proud owner of the trespassing cat, strung colorful lights across his porch in defiance of Karen's previous mandates. Jenny's kids set up a lemonade stand right in front of Karen's house, with free cups for anyone who wanted to share a laugh about the neighborhood's newfound freedom. Even I couldn't resist a bit of playful rebellion. I placed my garden gnome front and center in my yard, surrounded by a little decorative fence for emphasis. A few other neighbors joined in, putting up their own gnomes, flamingos, and quirky decorations as a quiet tribute to the victory. Karen, for her part, kept a low profile. She avoided the HOA meetings and stopped her patrols around the block. Though she still shot the occasional glare in my direction, her days of terrorizing the neighborhood were officially over. It wasn't just about the rules or the fines. Karen's downfall marked a turning point for the neighborhood. It was as though the community had collectively decided to stand up for one another, and the sense of camaraderie was stronger than ever. Justice had been served, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt like home again. With Karen's reign of petty tyranny behind us, life in the neighborhood began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The once tense air felt lighter, and the sounds of friendly chatter replaced the uneasy silence that had accompanied her patrols. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving a brighter, more united community in its wake. Karen, surprisingly, kept to herself after her public humiliation. Rumors swirled that she was planning to move, but no one dared to ask her directly. For the first time, the neighborhood no longer revolved around her whims and complaints. People were free to live without fear of finding a neon-colored violation notice taped to their door. The neighbors embraced the newfound sense of freedom in small but meaningful ways. Tom let his cat roam the yard without worry, while Jenny's kids set up lemonade stands with glitter-covered signs. Even the HOA meetings, once Karen's personal stage, became productive and calm, a place to solve real issues rather than petty disputes. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory every time I walked past my garden gnome, still proudly standing in its spot. It had become a symbol of resilience, a small but powerful reminder that sometimes, the best way to deal with ridiculousness is to stand firm and let karma do the rest. On one particularly quiet evening, as I sipped iced tea on the porch, I caught a glimpse of Karen walking her dog. For the first time, she didn't stop to glare at my lawn or scrutinize my mailbox. Instead, she simply nodded, a subdued acknowledgement of her new place in the neighborhood. And with that, life went on. The grass grew freely, the mailboxes stood tall, and the neighborhood thrived without Karen's meddling. We weren't just a group of houses anymore. We were a community bonded by shared laughs, rolled eyes, and the knowledge that no matter how entitled someone might be, justice and a little humor would always prevail. Have you ever had a Karen in your neighborhood or dealt with someone who took their sense of authority a little too far? Share your wildest HOA or neighborhood drama stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. If you enjoyed this wild ride through Karen's antics and her ultimate downfall, don't forget to smash that like button. And if you want more stories like this, packed with drama, humor, and a satisfying dose of karma, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Trust me, there's plenty more neighborhood chaos to uncover.